I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner. Today we'll be talking about Wolfram, and I think we'll get to the subject of the Ruliad quite soon, but I wanted to, before we get there, to raise the question of dual aspect monism. I think that would be a good prelude to set things in context, because I want to discuss with you how we might eventually relate Wolfram's overall system and then the Ruliad, in contrast to the dual aspect monism paradigm that you've developed. And I mean, for years, I've thought that that's the most logically economical way of explaining, right, what we experience, right, in this universe. So can we start with sort of your thoughts, as much detail or as general as you wish to be, on what is the dual aspect monism and how have you developed it specifically?
So dual aspect monism in general is supposed to be one of the ways that you answer the mind matter problem. But it's a more general ontology as well. It's a more general picture of the world. But it's basically when people study dual aspect monism, they're trying to solve the relationship, the parallelism between mind and matter. And obviously there are standard paths. You can go down the materialist path, which most people are these days, which is just that there's just matter, and mind is somehow being generated by that matter, but it's not really a separate category of its own. And then you've got idealism, which reverses that. It says, well, there's actually just mind fundamentally, and somehow you generate the appearance of matter from mental stuff, from mind stuff. And then there's dualisms, which both. They say both are categories of being. There's mental stuff, there's mind stuff, and then then you really have the problem, right, of explaining, well, why is it that they seem to parallel so well? Why is it that they track, that a thing in the outside world tracks what's going on in the inside of my going on in my mind? So they face a sort of causal problem that the other ones don't really face in the same way. And what dual aspect monism does is say that what looks like a situation where there's two things, a dualism, is really just one thing being described in two different ways, from two different kinds of perspective. So it's one thing, but you're describing it in two ways, and it's a kind of a duality in a different sense, to do with perspective, rather than there being two separate substances. And then there are various ways of sort of spelling, just like there are various ways of spelling out what you mean by materialism and what you mean by idealism. There are lots of different ways of making sense of that. There are a few different ways of making sense of dual aspect monism as well. I mean, one is that there is something, I mean, all of them are characterized by the idea that there's something beyond both mind and matter. So something that is neutral with respect to mind and matter, so psychophysically neutral. And then you can consider this in multiple different ways. Again, you can either think that, well, there's some sort of substance or some sort of atoms that you build mind and matter from, to build this sort of thing that is then interpreted in two different ways. And this is the approach of people like, Bertrand Russell, these neutral monist positions, people like William James as well, where their atoms are sort of pure experience. And then there's the way that I prefer, and it seems like you prefer, which is this sort of a more Spinozistic, I suppose it would be, approach, which is that there's a totality, which is psychophysically neutral, and you decompose it in various ways to get the mind and matter.
Mhm.
And because you're thinking in terms of this decomposition into these parts, you get your correlations for free. They're sort of an implication of the fact that you are dividing this object into a mental aspect and a physical aspect. So as I said, this is Spinoza considered sort of dividing into infinitely different, infinitely many kinds
Yes.
of ways. The way so I did this book with Harold Atmanspacher on dual aspect monism, where we try to develop these models, and we show that there's a bunch of people who you might not necessarily expect would have these kinds of views. David Bohm is probably the most obvious one, where he has this idea of a totality, the implicate order, which he considers the splitting is sort of conceived in terms of this thing called unfolding,
Yes.
and you go back into the implicate, and it unfolds into the explicate order, which is going to have these manifest mind and matter poles, as he calls them, in which we will see certain kinds of correlation, but they're not really causally connected or anything like that. It
Mhm.
appears that they're causally connected, but it's just because they're coming from one and the same source that's being described in different ways. And then we find in this book I mentioned a few different approaches like this. One is Arthur Eddington's approach and John Wheeler's approach, which we bundle together because they sort of seem to unite on this idea that at bottom there's fundamentally information, bits, zeros and ones,
Mhm.
which is psychophysically neutral. And also some elements from the Jung and Pauli correspondence. So Pauli, I mean, it's not just in the correspondence. Pauli has plenty of work on his own where he's not speaking with Jung, where he's saying
Yes.
something very, very similar, which is that the psyche or mind and matter are not independent. They're sort of coming from one and the same source. So there's sort of the idea of a split between materialism and idealism is not a valid category. Basically, it's not. It becomes obsolete,
Mhm.
and there's instead this invisible reality which we're just seeing the effects of because the only way of making sense of it is precisely by splitting it into these correlated mind and matter linkages. There's no other way of making this totality manifest itself other than by imposing categories of experience which necessarily invoke a split between the mind and what it's sensing, what it's experiencing.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, in Jung's work, obviously, this leads to the ideas of synchronicity. Pauli
Yes.
himself has a way of thinking about this, which is that there are acausal correlations between your mental states and your physical states. They're spurious correlations, and what they're doing is they're coming from this, whatever it is, this invisible reality that it's hard to make sense of, because the only way we can make sense of it is by getting these splittings.
Mhm.
So I think that's the basic idea of dual aspect monism. And just to finish, the way we present it in the book is that it's not a fundamental dualism. So it's a dualism, but the mind matter duality is non-fundamental. What's
Yes.
fundamental is this psychophysically neutral additional thing, which it's hard to speak about.
Mhm.
It's what people would think of. I mean, Jung called it the unus mundus.
Mhm.
There's uh, there's probably 1,000 different names for it in the mystical literature and
Sure.
elsewhere.
Sure. I know a lot of listeners, right, will be aware of the growing adherence to the growing popularity of idealism. We see this online, at least, right, a lot. And
Hmm.
the argument that's usually given in favor of it, right, in currently I'm referring to, is that this idealism is the most economical explanation of what we experience because it has the least number of assumptions. Right? Now, uh, two questions. Right? First would be, what do you think about that claim? And then, you know, and then I'll add this observation just right off the bat. Um, I think that, right, where the allusion is to, of course, what's known as Occam's razor, right? And the maybe there is this sometimes, I think, misinterpretation, right, of that. And that is that the simplest explanation suffices, which is not what the rule is. It's that we should not multiply essences, right, beyond
Mhm.
necessity. Sometimes it is
Mhm.
necessary to multiply essences, right? And even in literature, which I have worked with a long time, if you look at the literary relationships between two pieces of ancient literature, for instance, we know there's some kind of relationship between them, right? And so we could say, well, the simplest way to ask is which uh, piece influenced the other, right? But sometimes the relationship is much more intricate than that, right? There's many instances in Virgil's Aeneid, for instance, which obviously are echoes of Homer, right? Which he's reworking throughout the entire Aeneid. But we do know that some of those echoes, right? Virgil did not make them directly based on Homer, but he has himself developed the reworkings of Homer of previous Latin poets, and sometimes to right with two links in the chain, so two different Latin poets have already reworked Homer with a certain wording, and so Virgil is playing off of those rather than directly off Homer. All right, so now we have to multiply two essences, right, to get the answer, to establish and describe the correct, right, an actual relationship, right, between the Aeneid and an echo in Homer. So, right, so sometimes the simplest number of assumptions actually, right, is not complex enough. So, what do you think about this claim that's circulating quite a bit and has a lot of popularity that idealism, right, is superior to dual aspect monism because it has the least number of assumptions, and that is that we,
Well,
right, we there is only consciousness because that's what we experience.
um, well, I mean, it begs a lot of questions. It doesn't show that it's any simpler than materialism. And I mean, obviously, it needs to be unpacked as well. The
Sure,
particular kind of idealism.
sure.
If you're and it leads to one of the problems with idealism, which is the problem of intersubjectivity. I mean, is there just one mind stuff, or are they multiple minds that also interact in some way? So it's not clear whether there's individuality involved in how you get individuality if you're just dealing with mind stuff. If you take it to the limit where you've got something like a universal mind,
Mhm,
then you end up not so very far away from the kind of dual aspect monism that we discuss in the book and that David
mhm,
Bohm's defend. You end up with something like Schrodinger's view, right?
mhm,
Uh, Associated with things like the Veda, the Indian, ancient Indian philosophies and so on, that you're subdividing. So it would first have to be spelled out that you know exactly how many um, entities and assumptions you're dealing with and the specific type of idealism that you've got. The way we present dual aspect monism, I mean, you do have, um, I think, probably um, the simplest position, which is just that there is one.
mhm.
There is one thing. It's hard to even call it a thing.
Sure. Yeah.
There's one substance, something a bit like Plotinus's one or something like that, that
Mhm,
then gets decomposed. So it's hard to, yeah, I mean, it's hard to make comparisons because there are so many different kinds of position in idealism.
mhm, mhm,
And it's hard to make sense of Occam's razor, as you say. Anyway, there are different ways of making sense of that in terms of simplicity of laws, how many entities you are postulating. I mean, the way I understand it, it's usually in terms of multiplication of types of entity
yes.
rather than rather than essences. Um,
Well,
in terms of
essentiae
types of
can
entity,
be understood as entities as well, I think. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So in this case, materialism and idealism and this version of dual aspect monism that we've just been talking about are all, they're sort of equivalent in that sense. I don't see how idealism would score use, using Occam's razor. I mean, it scores probably in the sense that you alluded to, which is that the the object of our immediate experience is mind stuff, right? We don't. It's what we have direct access to, and then, as Eddington once put it, everything else beyond this immediate experience is inference, is pure
Yes,
inference.
yes.
It's an inference to matter. So they have the edge when it comes to explaining that, right? They're dealing with what is most immediate to us.
Yes.
So I agree that there's something good about that. What they don't get is this problem of other minds and intersubjectivity, how the laws work, how it seems to be that I mean, we still end up with these correlations. We still have this appearance of an external world that obeys certain laws and so on. So then the onus is on them to try and explain these things.
Yes. Well, for myself, yeah, I think because there's so many different models, right, of all of these paradigms, like dual aspect monism, materialism, idealism. It's almost endless of the different varieties and flavors. And so, yeah, I appreciate it is difficult, right, to address that question without specifics, right? But so I try to generalize in what I said that it's based on this what's usually called an intuition, right? This is our immediate experience, this consciousness, and so everything can be explained in those terms. But as you say, I think if we look at many brands of materialism, they would not say that consciousness is a separate entity that needs explanation. It's just a part of matter, just a function of matter. And so, in that sense, it's as economical, as you say, as some stripes of idealism. In any case, you mentioned the word rules there, I believe, and so I mean that'll take us to Wolfram quite nicely, right? Uh, and so you're going to be speaking at the Sicily Consciousness Conference on the subject of Stephen Wolfram's what would we call it, as a paradigm, a construct, or his idea, which is known as the Ruliad. So can you give us a really quick initiation into the Ruliad?
Oh,
I mean,
yeah. I mean, well,
you have
look,
to set it in the context of Wolfram's overall approach, of course. Right?
yeah. I mean, so his overall approach, I think I mean, he's quite famous now because he's been in the news with Chat GPT,
Yeah.
and he's been working on trying to, what is it, give it its superpowers so that it doesn't hallucinate and give wrong answers to basic questions. But so the overall approach comes from what he started developing when he was working on cellular automata models on this idea of digital physics,
Mhm.
which is the idea that the world is fundamentally computational, and God is a programmer idea. And what it's developed into most recently is this thing that he calls the Ruliad model, or Ruliology. And it's supposed to be a new kind of theory in this landscape of digital physics and computational theories, where the advance comes from viewing things in terms of what he calls multi-way graphs and multi-way processes. So rather than just considering the evolution of one system, like in a Turing machine, where you let your system evolve step by step.
Mhm.
If you start with some particular configuration, it could be a string of letters, A, B, A, B, B, A. You consider all possible ways of permuting or applying some rule to this particular initial string. So rather than just going one step by step, you consider this branching graph of all possible ways of applying some rule to some particular initial structure. And then if you consider all possible initial conditions like that and all possible ways of applying all possible rules, and you imagine the completion at infinity of applying and letting all of these run, basically, then you get this object called the Ruliad. So, I mean, and the way it's set up is in terms of these things called hypergraphs. So it's not supposed to be a substance. Like the Ruliad is not a thing, and the rules are not a thing. In the same way that a Turing machine is not, it doesn't necessarily have to operate on real systems for it to make sense. So you start with these abstract structures called hypergraphs, which are not located in space-time. This is the crucial thing. And it turns out, in fact, I think that this whole model is a good way of representing this psychophysically neutral thing that we were talking about earlier, right? The implicate order, or whatever you want to call it. It's not physical, it's not mental, it's not based in space-time, and yet it's supposed to somehow generate all of these things. So somewhere in this Ruliad, there will be a kind of thread going through some particular path that will be an observer. Okay, and it will, and the step-by-step evolution of this thread, right, where you've got a process that's doing one step after another in a computational fashion, applying the rules, is generating the time of this observer. But what is interesting is that there is no physics in this Ruliad without that observer. So because there's all possible processes and all possible, there are many possible laws and even many possible systems of mathematics. So the way Wolfram describes it, it would contain all possible axiom systems, as well as all possible systems of physics. And then the reason why we find the particular physics that we find is that we're sampling a particular portion consistent with our constitution as observers of this Ruliad. So it's local. So our physics is essentially local relative to the Ruliad. And this is quite exciting, I think, because it points to all sorts of possibilities regarding other forms of observer and other forms of life, other forms of intelligence that could sample things in different ways and have entirely different systems of physics and different systems of mathematics, depending on which thread and how they're threading through the Ruliad. So, I mean, this is, this forms a bit of my interest in these models. But, to go back to the dual aspect monism issue, it seems pretty clear to me that this is, when we consider the Ruliad as a whole, where you're considering the completion of all those possible rules running to infinity, what you have is a totality that is psychophysically neutral, that has no objects or minds until you've made a certain split and told it which bit's being sampled, right? Until you've introduced an idea, an observer or a knower or an experiencer, and then you get your matter and your objects associated with that. So it's almost like an observer is foliating this Ruliad in a certain way and generating the physics. But until you do that, there is no physics. And this is kind of what we mean when we're talking about dual aspect monism, right? There's this realm, this invisible realm that you make manifest by considering how it appears to observers.
So this is overlapping then with participative creation, right? Which you've talked about.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So when you're talking about this observer, right, this is sort of basically shaping the physics or the mathematics of that particular space. Probably not the right word. It's not, but that particular variant, right? So what is? Can you expand a little bit on this model of the participatory creation, or I'm sure there's another terminology that we could use. But...
Yeah, well, I mean, it would be something. I mean, it's a relational manifestation of physical reality, I suppose. It would be something like that. But there is a bit of a problem with it, which
Hmm.
is what I'm working on at the moment, which is that obviously the observer can't be anything separate from the Ruliad
Correct.
in this model. It's got to somehow be generated and included in this initial expansion of initial conditions by the
Right.
rules.
Hmm.
And it itself is going to be part of the abstract relational structure. So it's abstract
Hmm.
still.
Yes.
The observer is still going to have to be abstract in a certain sense because the Ruliad is abstract. And
Hmm.
yet somehow from this abstract structure, we're supposed to generate something that appears solid,
Concrete.
that appears
Hmm.
concrete. Yeah.
Hmm.
So there's something very similar. We spoke about it last time we chatted. I don't know whether we
Yes.
recorded it, but we started talking about Max Tegmark's
Yes. Yes.
multiverse
Hmm.
theory. So he thinks of these four levels of reality with different ensembles, different multiverses,
Hmm.
and the one that's relevant here is the level four, where you're dealing with abstract mathematical structures.
Hmm.
And he faces the exact same problem, which is that if everything is just an abstract mathematical structure, then that means we, observers, are abstract mathematical structures. So you're going to have to explain how you get this concreteness appearing
Hmm.
in this system. The way he does it, he says, and I think Wolfram has to do a similar thing, he says that there are self-aware substructures. Doesn't go into it much beyond that, but some of these mathematical structures have the property of being self-aware.
Hmm.
They would have to, be able to experience. So one of the things I've started to look into, this is a new project basically, is whether you can apply things like second order cybernetics, where you explicitly model the observer's states in your physical models.
Hmm.
So it looks like he's kind of doing that. Wolfram understands he
Hmm.
needs the notion of an observer to get any notion of physics out.
Right.
Right? It's not unique, the physics we get, but he still needs a notion of observer. So he's going to need a model, a decent model of an observer
Hmm.
in this approach. What he has so far is just this idea that there is a curve essentially through through the Ruliad
Hmm.
going up, like a time, almost like a world line, a Minkowski world line.
Hmm.
And he explains it just like Hermann Weyl explained the flow of time and consciousness, which is just, you're
Hmm.
sort of creeping up the world line.
Hmm.
It seems to me that it's a very similar way of thinking, but it's not a definite model or anything like that. So I
Hmm.
think there's work to be done there, basically, which
Right.
philosophers could
Right.
get.
Well, yeah, it also seems that Tegmark's model at the universe is math, right? That's what in his popularizing expression there. But Tegmark's model, um, I think the Ruliad, and then there is also I mentioned to you in our last conversation, Arkan Hamid's idea of the triadic permutations of gluons, right? That these produce, or these permutations, right? As they multiply, they begin to construct more complex structures, right? But initially, just the single and two gluons, when they begin to interact triadically, these structures have no space-time or quantum mechanical properties. But when they complexify, this is what
Hmm.
he suspects. It's just a hypothesis that maybe generates space-time and quantum mechanical properties. But the problem with all three of those, and we could multiply the theories, of course, as you pointed out before, is how do you get from the abstract to the concrete? And of course, I don't have an answer, but if we invoke a dual aspect monism basic structure, right? What do you think about this idea that, well, maybe you can't get from um, the abstract to the concrete unless both of those, right, are emerging from something that is more primary, right? And so
Hmm.
that each node, right, in this binary, right, of the abstract and the concrete, actually possess qualities of each other that create some kind of continuity between them, right? And so in that way, yeah, there could be sort of this exchange between them. One state could lead to the other, back and forth, even possibly. I don't know, but so if we plug in these contraries or these nodes of the binary, abstract and concrete, and they're manifesting from something more primary that comprises both. So could that possibly be a way of tackling this?
I don't know. I think the way that seems natural to me, based on what I've been looking at with dual aspect monism, is that the notion of concrete is, situated in the same sort of conceptual space or ontological space or whatever you want to call it as space, time, mind, and matter.
Yes.
Namely, not fundamental.
All right.
So it's really not. They're not really concrete. There's nothing really concrete.
Mhm.
It is ultimately, but maybe the problem is that it's wrong to call it abstract in the first place, because if you're a dual aspect monist, this more fundamental thing is not really a thing that bears qualities, and abstractness is still a quality.
Mhm.
It's still sort of pinning it down, and then you oppose it to its negation, which is concrete, and then it's basically being conceptualized. The whole point is that all your conceptual structure is emerging from this thing, but it doesn't have it itself.
It's
So I would
pre-qualitative.
say exactly. So I think it's probably a mistake to start in these kinds of models by supposing that they're abstract in the first place.
Mhm.
The problem is, we're already a certain with Wolfram's model. We've already gone a little bit up the conceptual ladder,
Mhm.
right? We're not fully in the realm of sort of the absolute or something like that. We're
Mhm.
sort of probing down, drilling down a little bit further, just as mathematics itself does, and as things like music and dreams and symbolic things do. But we're still not at ground zero or anything like that. So obviously that's the reason why we use words like abstract. But
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know.
Well, yeah.
I mean,
So yeah, please go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, in most of the models that we discuss in that book, if you want to have any kind of model of this more fundamental substance, then you have to do at least some sort of conceptualizing with it. Otherwise, you become a sort of apophatic
Yes. Yes.
theologist with respect to your models,
Mhm.
and you can't say anything. You've
Right.
got to lift it a little bit out of there to get a grasp, to get a grip on it.
It's
Um,
all, yeah. It's almost as if the pre-qualitative state, that monistic state, to produce the binary, the abstract, the concrete, sort of. I mean, you have to invoke something like emergence, which is quite
yeah.
nebulous, but it's commonly invoked to explain all sorts of phenomena. But maybe that's just because we don't know how to explain, right, the transition. So it's emergence. But
Yeah, I mean, this is the hardest. This is the hardest thing to do in the book. This is, as far as I'm concerned, the hardest problem is why does it split? Why does this totality split into the various bits that it splits into? What causes it? You want to speak of something causing it, or some mechanism. You want to know what the ground of the splitting is.
sure, sure.
That I just can't do. It's this same problem.
Hmm.
Because exactly, it's probably similar, I suppose, to things like the emanations of Plotinus's one, where you're also wondering, well, how did it do it? How does this one substance split into these emanations? Are they separate? Are they the same? Are they still the one? Or
Sure.
it's a very similar problem,
Yes,
I
and
find.
none of the Middle Platonic, well, Platonic, Middle Platonic, or Neoplatonic philosophers could ever supply an answer. How do you get from the one to the many? That's the basic question. right. And so the best that can be done is to say that, well, the relationship between them is, sort of like in a mode of, in Greek, right, metaxu, right? So sort of this link that's actually not touching, right? But it still doesn't offer an explanation. It's only a description, right? That, well, there's still no direct link, right, from the one to the many. Their relation is one of metaxu, right? And so it's just piling up words to describe the our inability to link the two, right, in a real concrete, quote unquote, concrete way, in a real direct way, right? It's frustrating, but
Yeah,
that's the
and I'm not,
philosophy on that issue.
and I'm not sure how to deal with it. I mean, I think you've mentioned, I think we talked about this before as well. The idea of the development from a child's initial state where it's not,
Yes,
it's in a kind of non-dual state where there's no split between self and other,
right.
subject and object.
Hmm.
There must be a point at which that happens, and then
Well,
you might say, well,
hmm, go ahead.
what was the causal factor? What was the mechanism? There might be some sort of related way of drawing an analogy between these other
Hmm.
situations where it seems like we've gone from non-duality to duality, and when did it happen, and what caused it to happen?
Hmm.
I mean, do you have thought? This is more your sort of area of, you like to think about
Sure.
these.
Right, and I think it is quite relevant, right? I think maybe it was Freud. His sort of idea was that, yeah, if we could understand how an infant acquires language, we could understand the universe, right? So it's I think it's apropos. It pertains to it. But if we look at an infant um, at the earliest stages, right, it is certainly conscious, has consciousness, but this
Mhm.
narrow strip of consciousness, which we call the individual ego, is not fully formed yet, right? And it will be forming, right, solidifying, right, as the child begins to experiment with sound and speech, right? And in fact, those are the same things. That's why the French linguist Emile Benveniste, right? He was just stated bluntly: the ego is totally a linguistic construct, right? And that actually agrees with the evidence, right? So if we look at an infant, it starts to babble, and as it forms speech, uh, the speech levels and the conceptual levels will always be identical, right? Because they're developing in tandem, because they're really just two manifestations of a single process, right? And so, of course, let's say an infant it has some so-called handicap and can't actually physically speak. There are substitutes, right? And so we know that reading Braille actually operates, or activates the same region of the brain as our speech does, right? In this mode, right? So it's like it's not as mysterious as the chicken and the egg scenario. Which came first, right? They we know they're the same thing, really, right? And so we think, because of grammar, we're thinking with excuse me, because of language, we're thinking, right, with syntax and grammar, right? And so that's the difference between how Homo sapiens think, right, and let's say a dog. A dog doesn't have language in the sense, sure, they have communication, they can bark and all of this, but that's not in it varies. It's not invariant, and uh, the whereas our thinking would comprise syntax and grammar, their thinking largely, I believe, of course, is disputed, but largely is visual. It's sort of a visual conceptualization, which is what
Mhm.
we do at a more primitive state, right? Our ancestors, but evolutionary ancestors, but also as infants, right? So really, this consciousness and language have a lot to do with our advanced visual capacities. Right? This is
Mhm.
very well known. But anyway, so at a certain point, right, of the infant babbling and then acquiring words and speech, at a certain point, right, they're able to pass what we call the mirror test, right? And we do this with animals as other animals as well. Before that point, the infant will look into the mirror and see the image and think it's someone else, right? But when that ego is really in place and functional, right? They've heard their name so many times, it's created itself within them, that they are this entity that's called whatever the name is. Then they look into the mirror and they know that they're looking at the self, right? So, right, we know that many animals can do this. Magpie birds, the other primates, dogs, right? So there's, many animals have this high degree, right, of this ego, but it's not subsisting in the modality of syntax and grammar of language, right? It's more visual, and I'm sure we will, not being dogs, we can't know fully, right? We can only sort of intuit it and guess it and deduce it. But in any case, all right. So
So as
Piaget,
so
oh,
as
go ahead. Well,
no,
Piaget
I was just
Bohm said that as this is happening, the spatial temporal perceptions of the infant are also solidifying.
I would like to interject here that after the recording of this interview was over, Dean Rickles and I shared a brief correspondence that he gave me permission to quote. I first sent him the message regarding the split from the totality using the analogy of the infant. This split happens when consciousness transitions to self-reflective consciousness, the emergence of the linguistic ego, that is. So would the pre-linguistic state of the totality forbid us associating it with consciousness in non-reflective self mode? Or is the totality prior to both consciousness and self-reflective consciousness? And Dean's response was, I would view the pre-qualitative state as something like psyche, so that totality could well be something like pure non-reflexive consciousness, but all depends on how these terms are defined, of course. Neither of us mentioned in the beginning was the word, maybe too obvious, but if this idea of concretizing, objectivizing the world through language holds, it is obviously pivotal. Dean there is referring to the opening of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, is the usual translation, but actually the Greek word for word there actually means the mind or reason and speech, right? So it's doubly applicable. I would also add that consciousness as such in the infant before the development of the ego is still a dualistic consciousness. So there is no pure consciousness in the sense of non-dualistic consciousness. All consciousness is dualistic. It's just that before the development of the ego, the infant is conscious of the surroundings, right? Not always in a focused, very totally focused way to the degree that it's going to be once the ego is fully formed, but still it's aware of things. So it's consciousness aware of something, right? So it's already dualistic. There is no monistic consciousness, right? It's just that when the ego is formed, then we have that consciousness is aware of itself, right? Self-reflexive. All right, back to the interview.
as we go into dream states then, which are, I assume, a bit more pre-linguistic. So we've still got symbols, of course. So the idea would be, as we're going more into the symbolic, we're losing some of the ego, which does, I suppose, seem to happen. So it would go in the reverse direction as well.
Yes, and
Essentially,
something of it remains
that's what.
since there is language in
Yeah.
dreams, right? But there's also an intensification of symbols and imagery. They
Yeah.
become more vivid. Yeah. So
Yeah.
right. So how to get back to your point, right? So how to correlate this with the question of the transition from the so-called abstract to the concrete, right? So if we think of language Um, well, it becomes a wide field, right? Because uh, we're now suddenly also connecting this, right, to just structure as such, right? So number, mathematics, which is right the study of pattern and structure, right? So it's a form of pattern, it's a form of structure. Language is, right. So now, right, we can connect that uh, in a certain extent, right? It is abstract, but we can connect that with all of these structures that Wolfram talks about, that Akani Hamid talks about, that Max uh, Tegmark talks about, right? Um, but I see we're here on a path, right? We're thinking, live. Uh, um, so these are questions. I'm not trying to deliver an answer. So how do you
Yeah, I mean,
correlate
look,
this?
so in the book, in the book with Harold Altmanspacher,
Mhm,
I mean, we say something a little bit similar. We start drifting towards this idea of meaning, setting up meaning relations, which presuppose, you know, seem to presuppose something relational. We usually think of it, maybe like Brentano. You have there's intentional objects. There's a mental state, and it's supposed to be lining up with something physical. And we sort of try and find something like, Jung has this notion of a latent meaning
mhm,
in this unus mundus, the
mhm,
archetypal realm. And the reason why we seem to find these synchronicities and these correlations and the psychophysical correlations is because there's this initial latent meaning that is sort of generating them.
mhm,
But it's still hard to make sense of that,
mhm,
of what we mean by latent meaning, and why is that generated, and why does that then lead to this, you know,
mhm,
this
mhm,
situation where we've got a mental and a physical pole that are correlated. It's still there's still the fragment of the same problem there, even though we think that meaning does play a role in this.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. Well, I
It's still
correlate
difficult.
one way to do it. There's many ways to do it, but one way to correlate something to correlate with meaning, right, is it's a network of relations, right, that
Hmm.
produces a meaning, right. So or perhaps it's safer to say we can't have meaning without some type of network of relations, right. And that leaves it open, right. We can give different definitions to different modes of meaning, right. But one piece of this puzzle perhaps has to do with another point that Ben Beniste pointed out. He has a brilliant article. This is probably 1960s or so. A brilliant article on Aristotle's 10 categories of thought.
Mm.
And this is an utterly persuasive essay. I mean, it's clear that he's correct in his claim that, well, when you look at each of the 10 categories of Aristotelian thought, each and every one of them, all 10, turn out to be simply the categories of the Greek language.
Hmm.
So, in other words, you can't have thought apart from some kind of language, right? Whether that's spoken written language or through Braille or whatever modality it is, right? But real human language. When we're thinking of human concepts and thoughts, we're talking about a structure that has syntax and grammar, right? And so, and it's also curious, right, that our direct experience of reality, right, of the world, right, is through consciousness, but it's through this narrow band of consciousness which we call the ego, which is a linguistic construct. Linguistic conceptual is the same thing. It's not through the deeper levels, because we have only indirect access through to those, right, through dream states or altered states of consciousness or something like this. Is what Chomsky points out as the we have our ego. Um, the language, right? Speech is outward aspect of language, but silent thought is also part of the outward aspect of language. The inward
Mhm.
aspect is totally inaccessible to us. That's down there in the so-called unconscious, where all these automatic processes are occurring, which manifests in this all of our conscious activity. So, like 99% or more of our consciousness is really being generated by these unconscious or automatic processes, right? So that's really where the interesting stuff is going on. So
Yeah.
there has to
You,
be structure down
you're,
there,
you're
right?
reminding me here. I was just trying to think of the argument now of this old book by Julian James on the bicameral mind.
Mm-hmm.
You know that book where he claims that
Yes.
there was a massive shift between the Iliad, the people of the Iliad, and the people of the Odyssey, in
Mm-hmm.
that what he was describing and the people around at the time of the Iliad didn't have the same sort of consciousness and introspection, and I assume ego and volition. He thought that the people at the time were basically automatons. And then something happened where they learned to introspect and get maybe a grip on more of these subconscious drivers and bring them out a bit. And then
Mm-hmm.
they got some kind of willpower, basically.
Mm-hmm.
They got a hold of their volitional powers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know that book?
Yes,
Sounds
intimately. Yeah, it's a sort of a cornerstone, of course, in all the different theories of consciousness and language. I agree with this basic point, although I don't think the Odyssey actually establishes this point. I believe we have to go past the Odyssey because, and a scholar named Bruno, that's the last name, a German scholar, Bruno, maybe more than a century ago, or about a century ago, probably, wrote a very good book about this topic. When you look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, things are really heavily quantitative rather than qualitative, right? So emotions are describing quantitative terms, right? And the body, there's no real sense of a unified body, right? It's just, and we see it actually in illustrations of the times. It's like the bodies are just look like all of these things thrown together. It's really not unified, right? And so it's with the later philosophic endeavors, right? Hellenistic philosophy, right? That we find this transition, right? That James is talking about, right? So I would put it later, but its basic point, yes, it works, but just not with the Odyssey. But that's
well, I suppose the way to view it would be that it's an ongoing odyssey of itself where we're
yes,
continually adding. If the theory is correct, it doesn't just stop there,
hmm,
right? It continues as you're going further and further, I
absolutely,
suppose, into something like these conscious drivers and trying to bring them out. And there are maybe new possibilities. In 1,000 years, we'll wonder what kind of strange beings, us two
sure,
were, and the way we spoke seemed very, very curious, and we were
sure,
missing lots of obvious things out.
hmm, hmm.
It's yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, and people have even made this argument. Harold Bloom made it in relation to Shakespeare. That his claim was that Shakespeare invented the modern concept of the human and the individual. If you look at tragedy, comedies, well, it was just theater before Shakespeare. The individual protagonists are archetypes. They're not really human individuals, right? With a romantic notion of subjectivity. Oh, this sort of
Yeah.
seems to be there suddenly with Shakespeare, right? Who was really some kind of gifted, abnormally, quote unquote, gifted. It just doesn't seem totally normal. There's something very unusual about Shakespeare. He's a genius, in other words,
Mhm.
and with linguistic abilities and his vocabulary, right, is not normal, statistically speaking. This is just amazing, right? And so it's what you would expect more of a group of people writing to produce such a varied vocabulary. But
Well,
as
that's
one
the theory,
individual,
right?
leaving aside all the conspiracy theories, which
Exactly.
I don't waste my time with. But in anyway, um, this concept yeah, it can be supported, but without the Odyssey. If you want to expand on that the basic idea, right, that Julian was proposing with this point of the Iliad, the transition from the Iliad to the Odyssey.
Mhm.
So, in your words, again, how is Julian describing that? What's his argumentation?
Well, I was just trying to remember the basic thing. I've not really studied this in any great depth. I mean, I was raising it from the point of view of this just the idea that we're constructing ourselves and our world by delving more deeply over time into this, whatever you want to call it, the unconscious drivers. If you've got a dual aspect monism, whatever you're doing mentally, whatever these new elements that you keep bringing out mentally are also going to be generating something physically as well. There's going to be sort of a physical component to that. So we're constructing our worlds and ourselves as we add these new conceptual structures. I
Right.
suppose, yeah.
And one thing that is being gained in the Greek tradition, the Hellenistic tradition, from start with Homer, obviously the Iliad and the Odyssey, but then compare it with the later stage of the ages of Hellenistic philosophy, is that there's no right in Homer. There's no real concept of a psyche in the later philosophical sense, right? This subjective identity, let's go back to the point I made about Shakespeare, right? And also, there's so the concept of the immortality of the soul, for instance, which Plato at that time he began to think about this idea and to develop various arguments, right, in favor of it, and so that all comes later. It's not there in Homer, and yet we know, right, that people in Homer's time and even before, right, in various cultures, they had this sort of concept of a pneuma, of a spirit, of something that is detachable from the body at death, right, or in the sleep state, right. Right, but it's very amorphous, and it's usually objectified in a way that even separates it from the human subject as such, as if it's some outside entity, right? Somehow, and of course, later there are ideas of like a heavenly double and concepts like this, but this idea of a qualitative soul, right, is not there in Homer. Greeks didn't have it at the time, right? And so it develops in the philosophical period. So with the philosophical reflection, yes, humans seem to be acquiring an increased understanding of their own depths, right? Which was now in qualitative terms, whereas before it was purely expressed in quantitative terms. Like, Agamemnon or some other hero, his sorrow, was multitudinous. I mean, Homer says things like this. It's like it's always expressed with quantitative examples, right? The qualitative examples are just like strangely absent. And so if we go back and read the Iliad, one will start to notice this. And it's
Yeah, but what I wonder is whether it's so you speak of it as if it's a sort of exploration of what's pre-existing, and as we're doing philosophical investigation, we're learning about what is already there. I wonder whether it's a construction job and we're sort of creating it as we go along.
I agree. I think it's both. I think in the discovery of what's already there, something new is also being created. Right. So there's something of our self-identity as moderns, right, as heirs to that long trajectory of Hellenistic philosophical consideration and contemplation that has made us what we are. And we would not have been that had some other trajectory played itself out. I guess you could invoke the Ruliad there as a metaphor. The different possibilities, right, different world lines that could emerge. Right? And in ours, I mean, of course, there are other humans and other cultures, right, which were not impacted as much by the Hellenistic model, but let's say by the Vedic models or the Upanishadic models. But be it as it may, I think in each and every one of those instances, something similar did happen. Right? It's like looking at the axial religions. There's something very strange about all of them being so similar, the concepts and rituals and systems. And with the philosophies that arose around the same time, like the Upanishads and then later Greek thought, it seems to be that there's an awful lot of similarity, always differences, of course, but there was also this very interesting overlap, right? They're dealing with the same issues, which I think are universal to humans, right? At the base of it. But people in modern India, right, have a certain experience of subjectivity in large part because of the trajectory of their own philosophical heritage, right? And so that's a discovery of what they were already, but it also produced something that's unique that would not otherwise have been produced. It could have been something else.
I mean, it's interesting to look at obviously the Eastern, like the ancient Indian views, which we usually think of as going inwards, as sort of exploring a completely different kind of inner space rather than as we did in the Western approach where we're ignoring that so we don't discover all of these things or create all of these things on the inside, the spirits and these kind of things. They seem to be pretty complementary approaches.
They can be markedly different too. Ben Beniste, again, to invoke, it's the same article I referred to, his article on the 10 categories of thought by Aristotle. Ben Beniste makes this point that Aristotle, on the subject of being, ousia, right, how he defines being is totally determined by the concepts or the structure of the Greek language. There are indigenous languages, right, right, that don't have the same vocabulary and the same connections, right, between different words that pertain to Greek and Latin mostly. And so they have, some groups may have a concept of being that is markedly different, right? It may seem defective or it may even seem more rich, right, than, an Indo-European based linguistic frame. So the language actually, right, is determining some of these models, and we think, like Aristotle thought his ideas on being was just like pure philosophizing, but we're reaching this epistemological barrier. Everything comes to our consciousness, which is linguistic in humans, and so all philosophizing, right, it has to be filtered through our consciousness, which is linguistic. So it's going to vary depending on the language.
Yeah, and there's clearly, I mean, better or worse languages for philosophy. It seems the Germans seem to do very well with very systematic positions in philosophy, which you don't find elsewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there are certain questions you simply can't ask depending on the conceptual structure. Why is there something rather than nothing? So certain Chinese systems, linguistic systems, don't really have the same kind of notion of nothing. It's not really a coherent concept. So you just can't pose certain things that we consider to be the most fundamental problems of philosophy don't even get to be conceived of in certain linguistic systems.
Maybe physicists should learn a bunch of new languages and see what comes up.
Yeah, well, I suppose that would be, again, part of this Ruliad system, is that there are a whole bunch of things we're missing because we're only exploring one very small sector of this Ruliad, which is a system of rules and computations. There's infinitely many others according to this model, which would give different perspectives on what we assume is the same thing, the same world.
Well,
I mean, just to stick. Just to stick with the point, I mean, you find the same thing in other representations as well. It's not just language. In art, there's very naive art forms. It's usually two-dimensional, very strange sort of stages that art goes through to get to this sort of what we think of as being heavily realistic. But again, I assume some of the same principles are happening there, where that was how they conceived of things at the time. I don't know whether they conceived of people being two-dimensional at the time, but this is how they are representing their world, and it tells you something about what they have got, about the concepts they have. How they draw something, how they represent something artistically is telling you something as well as in the linguistic context.
Yes. Like the point I brought in from Bruno, right? He points out these drawings from Homeric times. The way they depict the human body is just like this parts thrown together. It's not a unified whole, and that's really what we're seeing, right? In the language of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But another question about the Ruliad, right, is the deterministic, right, flavor of it all, right? So, do you think that when we take into account, not in the Ruliad, but like in the cellular automata models, right? So there's the rule 30, also 110 is another exception, right? So you have this. Well, I'll let you describe those. What's going on there, and then so this interjects randomness into all this determination, right? So have you thought about that?
So this is an important feature of the Wolfram model. So Rule 30 is just one of these old cellular automata models that I suppose they would be described as undecidable. You can't make a prediction, or you can't find an equation that will give you a shortcut, basically, to tell you how it's going to evolve. There's no equation of motion you've got. You've just got to let the system run. And there are in the Ruliad as well. There are computationally irreducible systems in the Ruliad as well, and observers would be one example of this. We would be computationally bounded, and I suppose we would call it something like, we would view it as something like free will, but it's basically an undecidable process that exists in the Ruliad. Doesn't mean it's indeterministic. It's completely deterministic, and that what's going to come out at the next step is completely determined by what went before, and it will give the same thing every time you run the same rule on the same initial condition. So it's deterministic, but it's irreducible, like the 30. Wolfram seems to think that this model, that his entire model, is indeterministic. I don't think it is. I think so. He thinks because it's got this multi-way branching structure,
Yes.
and what would happen when you've got this multi-way branching structure, what's happening is the observer is sort of going across a bunch of these possible paths that the universe is taking, and you get sort of quantum interference effects when they can't be considered together as one single state, right? When they can't be coarse-grained over to give a sort of single state of the system. That's when you get quantum interference effects. Coarse graining plays a big role in this. So he thinks because you can sort of get something like quantum mechanics in this way, he's got an indeterministic system. But the Ruliad itself, every single one of those branches is completely deterministic. So the system is about all of those branches. So although when you're within a branch, much like in the Everett multiverse interpretation, when you're in a branch, you don't know what's going to happen and you have to deal with probabilities. From the point of view of the Ruliad itself, it is a completely deterministic system. Every branch is predetermined. Every branch is stepwise deterministic, even though there's this irreducibility. So, but it's a really strange sort of combination of determinism, indeterminism, undecidability, all sort of merged in this strange system. So it's definitely well worth philosophers investigating this and the senses in which it's deterministic and indeterministic. As I say, I think it's very similar to the Everett many worlds interpretation, and it's not really indeterministic. You get it from being within the branch. And there's something very interesting when you consider this, the difference between viewing the Ruliad as a totality and viewing it when you're embedded within it. there's something very similar to the way people think about the explanation of the flow of time. You can think of a block universe where there's no change. If you imagine yourself embedded as an observer, then you get change. And you can even link this to interpretations of mathematics. So from the outside, if you're looking at it as a single totality, then you've got something like a platonic view. When you're embedded inside the system, then your natural mathematical interpretation, because time is a central element in this, because you need to let the system unfold step by step, then you've got something like an intuitionistic approach to mathematics would be more appropriate, where you're constructing the future states. You have to let them evolve. So it's like there's these complementary descriptions that depend on which perspective you're taking. You can be a Platonist about the totality, but an intuitionist about the embedded state. You can be a determinist about the totality and indeterminist about the embedded observer, or however you want to view that. There's just a lot of low-hanging fruit, I think, in terms of pulling apart the conceptual structure and the conceptual moves in this.
Right. And before I move on, how does Wolfram describe or understand free will, right, in the context of his whole system, I mean, including the Ruliad?
Yeah, I mean, he would probably associate it. I haven't spoken to him, so he would probably associate it with something like the irreducibility that we don't know. It's an epistemic thing. We don't know what the next stage is going to be. But there's not much in terms of sort of volition or action in this. The observer is something that gets generated deterministically.
Right.
And then because of its nature, because of its constraints, and it's computationally bounded, from its point of view, it's as if it has these, this knowledge asymmetry and things like that, which you need for, the notion that the universe is open and that you can maybe have an effect on it. He probably has explicitly mentioned free will somewhere amongst the many millions of words that he's already written on it.
Well, I recall, back in the new kind of science. So back in the day, right, quite a while. His paradigm was that free will is basically our ignorance, right, of how the patterns of the rules unfold. And so
that's pretty much what I said. You've got computational boundedness and irreducibility, which gives that which is not a particularly good notion of. I wouldn't call that free will. I mean, you can see how a knowledge asymmetry emerges.
Right.
But free will is something different. Free will is something external deciding. So that you don't. Free will is basically having chance in the universe, right?
Right. Well, he's really basically saying that our concept of free will is a misinterpretation of facts. That's basically what he was saying back in the 70s. I don't know if his thinking has changed or will change, right, in view of this new stage he's reached with the Ruliad, which has sort of put some of his views, I think, in flux. And I think he's, expressed that online, that he's reaching out even to a theologian, right, to try to understand some of the implications of the Ruliad, right. So he has a virtue, right, that is lacking among some scholars and scientists, with namely humility, right. So we don't know everything, and maybe we have to revise, right, our opinions, right, based on subsequent research. But in any case, I recall an analytical philosopher, Noah Horowitz, who wrote about Wolfram, this is some years ago, so before the Ruliad concept emerged, right? So he points out, first of all, that the Wolfram system is, right, basically deterministic, but we have something like Rule of 30, right, where suddenly we see things going off in a random pattern, right? And as I said, that also happens in number 110 as well, but for some reason, maybe latches onto the 30, just to talk about a single entity, right, to give it symbolic status. But in any case, what Horowitz did was to apply a certain concept from Quentin Marseillou to Wolfram's system, and so Marseillou is his basic idea is that the future is not determined by the past. I mean, in an ironclad way. There are, in other words, there are certain ruptures that occur in time, right? And he speaks of, when we translate it into English, at least, his French, he talks about eruptions, right? The I-R-R-U, not E-R, but I-R, these eruptions and these breaks that occur in time, right? And so this is where we can talk about, usually some authorities, this is where they invoke emergence, right? To explain the origin of matter, to explain the origin of life, to explain the origin of consciousness, right? So Mary Sue would say those are all the results of these eruptions, right, that take place, right, within time, right? And so you get these radical breaks and eruptions, right, and leaps, right? That's famously, right? That's the term. These leaps in evolution, right? So these are not the result, for him at least, they're not the result of, predetermined patterns, right, that are just developing into what they deterministically would have to, become. Rather, the pattern is playing itself out, as in Wolfram, but suddenly there's an eruption, right? There's a radical break in time. And this is what produces the leap that created matter, then the next leap that created life, and then the next one that created matter. And so, right, so this is not Wolfram, but Horowitz's synthesis of Wolfram and Mercier on this, right? So it's, for me, it's one way of perhaps modifying Wolfram, right, that would make it compatible, right, with free will, right, with something that's not totally determined, but by the past. But of course, right, it's all fraught with all types of opinions, right, about the nature of time and evolution. But you have any initial reactions? What Horowitz is trying to do there in merging Wolfram with this concept of Mercier's, like, eruption in time and radical breaks and emergence?
Yeah, I mean, I can't. The only way I can see how it would possibly fit into the Wolfram model is. So, I mean, look, part of the problem is Wolfram always has this completed Ruliad in mind as well as the evolving one. So that you've always got this problem of everything that can happen sort of has happened in the Ruliad. There's only necessity and impossibility in the Ruliad. There's no modal freedom in it. So, but that doesn't mean that there's no freedom of a different kind which can fit what you've just described, which is the physics that we're getting. What he's talking about is what we see, right? We see new novelty emerging. Well, that's observer based. That's based on how we're carving up, how we're foliating the Ruliad. For who knows what reason, there might be times when the notion of an observer is modified in such a way that it includes these different features of the Ruliad, which would correspond with something like different laws, the appearance of matter suddenly, or something completely different break. Depending on what that observer is and how that evolves, you're going to get a completely different world associated with it. But then the question is, that observer has to be part of the Ruliad itself. I mean, I should end soon because I do have to dash off, but there,
Sure, sure.
speaking of of limits, you just mentioned this idea that there's this sort of humility in this approach. Even talking to theologists and so on, there's a problem that I see with this notion of the Ruliad, which is that it's still observer based. It's still from the point of view of our representations. The Ruliad itself is a representation. So you can't assume that you can stand out just this once to construct everything that could possibly be this model of everything that is, was, and will be. It's still part of our frame, our perspective. So there's still a kind of veil there. You will never get beyond this veil that even the Ruliad itself is representation, is part of our representation. And there may be different Ruliads. We might be completely wrong about what we think is the maximal space of possibilities still.
Sure.
So there would always be this room for other things to happen and to surprise us. If we're not completely sure about that.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll know in 1,000 years from now, as you said. Yes. All right, Dean, I really appreciate your time and sharing us your thoughts with us and your wisdom and insight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I always enjoy it.
All right.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.